Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Our next lecture for today is the anatomy of the large intestine, or another name is the large bowel. The large intestine, in general, regarded as a muscular tube that is lined with mucosa. Muscular tube lined with mucosa or mucous membrane. In adults, it measures about 1.5 meter. It arcs around and encloses the coils of the small intestine. We can see that the small intestine is located at the central part of the abdominal cavity, while the large intestine extends at the periphery of the abdomen surrounding the small intestine. Tends to be more fixed than the small intestine. يعني هتكون large intestine is more fixed to the posterior abdominal wall by peritoneum than that of the small intestine, which lies more freely inside the abdominal cavity. The primary function of the large intestine is the absorption of water and electrolyte. Next is the storage of undigested material until it can be expelled from the body as feces. What are the parts of the large intestine? First is the cecum, appendix, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and anal canal. What are the cardinal features of the large intestine? Is the presence of the tinea coli. These are the longitudinal bands of muscularis, or the muscle layer of the large intestine, which is called tinea coli. This is one of the cardinal features of the large intestine. Second is the presence of what we call the appendices epiploicae. Appendices epiploicae, or the fatty tags. And the other feature is the presence of sacculation or the haustration. These are the cardinal features of the large intestine. Here, another diagram showing the cardinal feature of the large intestine. These are the tinea coli, which are the longitudinal bands of muscle that have three. This is the cross section is apparent. 3 bands of these longitudinal muscle that's called tinea coli. The other feature is the sacculation or the haustration, and the other feature is the presence of appendices epiploicae. Appendices epiploicae, these are the in yellow color, or another name is the fatty tags. These are pouches of peritoneum that is covering the large intestine and containing fatty tissue. So the sacculation that is apparent here is caused by the tinea coli, which are the longitudinal band, is shorter than the original length of the large intestine. يعني راح تكون هذه الباندز of tinea coli, longitudinal band of the tinea coli راح تكون أقصر من الطول الأصلي لللارج intestine، فكأنه راح تكون تسحب الانتستين وتسوي لنا هذا الشكل اللي نسميه sacculation أو الهاوستريشن، اللي هو راح يبين عندنا بالأشعة الملونة أيضا بهذا الشكل. By the presence of these transversely oriented processes or projections. We will take the first part of the large intestine, which is the cecum. Cecum, it is a blind-ended pouch, يعني muscular pouch, blind-ended muscular pouch situated in the right iliac fossa. The appendix is attached to its posтерomedial surface. إذن هذا هو الجزء الأول من large intestine وهو cecum. Cecum is completely covered with peritoneum. We can say that it is completely covered with peritoneum, but possesses this will give it a considerable amount of mobility, but it doesn't have mesentery. It have no mesentery, although it is completely covered with peritoneum and possesses a considerable amount of mobility, but it doesn't have a mesentery. The presence of peritoneal cover will fold fold and recesses around the cecum. We call these folds of peritoneum what we call the superior and inferior ileocecal folds, and in peritoneum that extend in between the cecum and ileum will form this fold, which is the superior and inferior ileocecal fold, and it will form a recess that is called the retrocecal recess، يعني ما وراء السيكم، retrocecal recess اللي هو الجيب اللي هو دائما يحتوي على الابندكس. What are the anterior relations of the cecum? Is the anteriorly coils of the small intestine, part of the greater omentum that is in yellow color, and the anterior abdominal wall. These are the anterior relations of the cecum. The medial relation of the cecum, important medial relation, is the presence of the appendix. What is the posterior relations of the cecum? It is related to the posterior abdominal wall, which is the psoas and iliacus, femoral and the lateral cutaneous nerve of the thigh, and the appendix that is commonly found behind the cecum that is in the retrocecal recess. These are the posterior relation of the cecum. We can see here the psoas, iliacus, femoral nerve, and the lateral cutaneous nerve of the thigh, and the appendix which is commonly found behind the cecum. What is the blood supply of the cecum? It is derived from the superior mesenteric artery because it is part of the midgut, through the anterior cecal artery and the posterior cecal artery. Definitely the veins will drain back into the superior mesenteric vein. What is the ileocecal valve? Ileocecal valve, this is a rudimentary structure, fold of mucous membrane, يعني two horizontal folds of mucous membrane, Another important part of the large intestine is the appendix, الزائدة الدودية. The appendix is a narrow worm-shaped muscular tube. Its base is attached to the posterior-medial surface of the cecum below the ileocecal junction, and the remainder of the appendix remain free. So it have a base that's attached to the posterior-medial surface of the cecum below the ileocecal junction, and its remainder will remain free. What we call the McBurney's point? This is in red color. It means the location of the base of the appendix. يعني it demarcates the location of the base of the appendix. It's located 1/3 of the way in between the anterior supraeleac spine and the umbilicus. This is what we call the McBurney's points. It demarcates the base of the appendix, since the free end of the appendix will be located in different region, as we will see in the next slide. So, as the appendix is part of the midgut, its pain will refer in early stage of the appendicitis. يعني بداية الالتهاب الزائدة راح نشوف أنه the pain will be felt in the midgut. The pain will be felt in the midgut, in the periumbilical area. Why? One of its causes, because the appendix is part of the midgut, or it is derived from the midgut. So the pain will refer to the umbilical region. Then, after when the appendix is inflamed and increased in size, the pain will shift to the right iliac region. That when the appendix touch the parietal peritoneum of the anterior abdominal wall, and the pain will localize to the right iliac region. Regarding the appendix length and location, first it is variable in length, and it might be from 8 cm to 13 or 15 cm, and it is variable in position. It might be pre-ilial, retroilial, subcecal, pelvic, that reach to the pelvic organ, or retrocecal and retrocolic, which is a common site, retrocecal. Here another variation in the position of the appendix, abnormal position of the cecum, وبالتالي abnormal position of the appendix, and it might be on the left side in rare cases. The appendix, if we take a cross section of the appendix, it is a muscular tube. As we said, it is a muscular tube that has coat of muscularis, يعني inner circular, outer longitudinal muscle layer, where there is containing a large amount of lymphoid tissue in the mucosa and submucosa. That is the tinea coli of the cecum. At the base of the appendix, يعني هيكون the cecum, it have 3 bands of tinea coli. At the base of the cecum, it will unite, these 3 bands will unite and will form a complete layer of longitudinal muscle layer for the appendix. What is the blood supply of the appendix? It is because as it is derived from the midgut, it takes originally its blood supply is from the superior mesenteric artery through the appendicular artery. Appendicular artery is a branch of the posterior cecal artery. That passes through the mesoappendix. Appendicular vein will drain into the posterior cecal vein that will drain at the end to the superior mesenteric vein. What is the nerve supply? In general, there are 3 nerve plexuses, one around the celiac artery. This is the artery of the foregut, which is the celiac artery, the superior mesenteric artery, which is the midgut artery, and the inferior mesenteric artery, which is the hindgut artery. Around the origin of each artery, there is a plexus that is called celiac plexus, superior mesenteric plexus, and inferior mesenteric plexus that could contain autonomic nerves to supply each part of the gut. يعني هنا راح تكون عندنا celiac plexus for the foregut, superior mesenteric for the midgut, for all the structure of the midgut, and the inferior mesenteric plexus for all the structures of the hindgut. فلذلك أنه راح تكون nerve supply of the appendix is derived from the superior mesenteric plexus, because embryologically it is derived from the midgut. The ascending colon. The ascending colon, next part, extend from the cecum to the right or hepatic colic flexure. It is located mainly in the right lower quadrant. It extends from the cecum up to the hepatic flexure or the right colic flexure under the cover of the right lobe of the liver. It is attached to the posterior abdominal wall, and it is tethered to the posterior abdominal wall by peritoneum, and there are medially and laterally, this reflection will form what we call the paracolic gutter. We have medial and lateral paracolic gutters. What are the anterior relation of the ascending colon is the coils of the small intestine, the greater omentum, and the anterior abdominal wall. All these are the anterior relation. What is the posterior relation of the ascending colon as it is tethered or attached to the posterior abdominal wall by the peritoneum? It is related to the structures on the posterior abdominal wall. These are the iliacus muscle, the iliac crest, quadratus lumborum muscle, the origin of the transversus abdominis muscle, and the nerves. عفوا يعني إضافة إلى هذا هو lower pole of the right kidney with the nerves اللي هي الإليو hypogastric and the ilioinguinal nerves. All these structures are the posterior relation of the ascending colon. What is the blood supply of the ascending colon is from branches of the superior mesenteric artery, which are the ileocolic artery and the right colic artery that pass in between the two layers of the peritoneum to supply the ascending colon. The transverse colon. Transverse colon is the longest part of the colon, extend in between the right colic flexure or the hepatic flexure to the left colic flexure or the splenic flexure. It might reach to up to 38 centimeter in length. It forms a U-shaped concavity, and this U-shaped concavity it might reach to the umbilical or even to the hypogastric region to the pelvis. This transverse colon is attached to the posterior abdominal wall by the transverse mesocolon. The phrenico-colic ligament will attach the left colic flexure to the diaphragm. Phrenico-colic ligament. هنا عندنا الترانسفيرس colon. Transverse colon is attached to the posterior abdominal wall by its mesentery, which is called transverse mesocolon. Transverse mesocolon will divide the greater sac into supracolic compartment and infracolic compartment. Here we can see that the transverse mesocolon is attached to the pancreas, to the posterior abdominal wall. What is evident here? This is the transverse colon attached by its transverse mesocolon to the pancreas, to the posterior abdominal wall. And this transverse mesocolon will give freedom for the transverse colon for the movement, not like that of the ascending colon and descending colon that are adherent to the posterior abdominal wall. The transverse colon have some degree of movement, can move, not like that of the ascending and descending colon. What is the anterior relations of the transverse colon? Is the greater omentum and the anterior abdominal wall. Greater omentum and the anterior abdominal wall. What is its posterior relation to the transverse colon? Is the second part of the duodenum, the pancreas, and the coils of the small intestine. All this structure lies posterior to the transverse colon. What is the blood supply of the transverse colon? The proximal 2/3 and the distal 1/3. Proximal 2/3 is related, or it is part of the midgut, while the distal 1/3 is part of the hindgut. So the blood supply of the transverse colon is derived from the superior mesenteric artery and part from the inferior mesenteric artery. So it is derived from the superior mesenteric artery and the inferior mesenteric artery. هيكون middle colic artery, which is a branch of the superior mesenteric artery for the proximal 2/3, و left colic artery which is a branch of inferior mesenteric artery for the distal 1/3. مثل ما قاعد نشوف هنا this is the superior mesenteric artery giving the middle colic and it will supply the proximal 2/3 while the distal 1/3 is supplied by the left colic artery which is a branch of the inferior mesenteric artery. As we said before, the proximal 2/3 is part or the last part of the midgut and the distal 1/3 is the first part of the hindgut. The descending colon. Descending colon lies in the left upper. طبعا at the periphery of the abdomen, يعني large intestine in general is located at the periphery of the abdomen. The descending colon lies in the left upper and left lower quadrants of the abdomen. It extends downward from the left colic flexure or the splenic flexure down to the pelvic brim where it becomes continuous with the sigmoid colon. Attached to the posterior abdominal wall by the peritoneum, it covers the fronts. It covers the fronts and the sides here where it forms the paracolic gutters. What are the anterior relation of the descending colon is the coils of the small intestine, greater omentum that is in yellow color, on the anterior abdominal wall. What are the posterior relations of the descending colon? These are structures of the posterior abdominal wall. These are the first, the lateral border of the left kidney, because the kidneys are tethered to the posterior abdominal wall. So one of the posterior relation of the descending colon is the lateral border of the left kidney. This is the left kidney. The origin of the transversus abdominis muscle. Origin of transversus abdominis muscle. Quadratus lumborum muscle. The iliac crest. Iliacus and iliopsoas. Iliacus and the psoas. Iliacus and left psoas muscle. Iliohypogastric, ilioinguinal nerves were lateral cutaneous nerve of the thigh and the femoral nerve. All these structures are the posterior relation of the descending colon. What is the blood supply of the descending colon is derived from the inferior mesenteric artery. These are the left colic artery, and the sigmoidal arteries. The veins will correspond to the arteries and drain back into the inferior mesenteric vein. As we said, because it is part of the hindgut, so its blood supply will be derived from the inferior mesenteric artery through the left colic artery and through the sigmoidal arteries. Important issue here is the lymphatic drainage of the colon. It is drained by lymph nodes and lymphatics that pass through between the two layers of the peritoneum to reach to the lymph nodes that's surrounding the inferior mesenteric nodes. These are surrounding the origin of the inferior mesenteric artery. As we explained previously, that the foregut and its structure, it will be drained to the celiac node. The midgut and its structures or its parts will drain to the superior mesenteric node, and the hindgut with all its constituent will drain into the inferior mesenteric nodes. طبعا هنا قعدنا here we have a different set of lymph nodes from the wall of the intestine to that lie in the mesocolon, and lastly until it reaches to the original lymph node around the origin of these arteries. the main arteries of the gut. These are the lymph nodes that will drain the descending colon, following the arteries until it reach the main lymph node, which is called the inferior mesenteric nodes اللي هي principal nodes. Thank you.